Today we're going to be talking about multiplying and dividing integers. So let's get right into it with example A. So here we are at example A, and it says to write the equation shown by this number line. So on this number line, we've got an arrow that goes from -10 to 0, and we've got that numbers line broken up by different sections. So this is going to be a division problem. I know that because I've taken my line and I've divided it into a certain number of sections. So to start off with, I know my number line goes from -10 to 0, so the number I'm going to be dividing is -10. So now the question is, how many times did it divide my number line? So I divided my number line into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections. So I know that I divided -10 by 5. And when I do that, I have to figure out what is between each one of my sections. So in one section, I've got from -10 to -8, that's 2. From -8 to -6, that's 2. From -6 to -4, that's 2. From -4 to -2, that's 2. And from -2 to 0, that is 2. So there is -2 in between each of my sections. So when I divide, I get -2. So that's how to show division of integers with a number line. Now let's take a look on how to do it with counters in example B. So here we are at example B, and it says write the division shown by these counters. So I've got 6 counters there. I've got 2, 2, 2, and I need to know how much each of these counters stand for. So over here on my left-hand side, I've got a key that tells me that -1 is equal to one of these red counters. So how many of the counters do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have 6 -1 counters or -6. Now I have to figure out how they're each divided. So they're divided into 3 separate groups. I see one group here, I see one group here, and I see one group here. So since they're divided into 3 groups, I'm going to say divided by 3. And then I got to figure out how much is in each group. So in each group here, I've got -2 counters inside this one, -2 counters inside this one, and -2 counters inside this one. So -6 divided by 3 gives me -2. And that makes sense. If I were to divide 6 by 3, I would get 2. In this case, I'm dividing -6 by 3. So I'm going to be getting -2. Let's go ahead now and have you try some on your own. So here we are at practice number 1. You're going to try these 2 problems on your own. The top one talks about number lines. The bottom one talks about counters. I know that it says counters on your paper. Let's go ahead and fix that. That's a mistake. And we're going to change counters to number line at the top. But counters at the bottom still works for us, so we're going to leave that one alone. I want you to try these 2 on your own. Pause the video now, and then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to get both questions correct? Did you notice that at the top, the lines went from 0 to -8, broken into 2 parts, giving us -4 in each one. And at the bottom, I've got -6, broken into 2 groups, so giving us -3 in each one. If your paper matches mine, great. If not, go ahead and make sure that it does now. And let's move on to example C. So in example C, it wants us to simplify this expression. We've got 4 next to a -2 inside parentheses. I don't see any sign there. So anytime I have 2 numbers in parentheses right next to each other with no sign in between, that means that I'm dealing with multiplication. So I know these 2 numbers are being multiplied together. So I have to figure out how they're being multiplied. I've got a number line there if I'd like to use that, and I've got some counters here if I'd like to do that. So let's start with the counters. So the number that's at the front is going to talk about how many groups we're going to have. So we're going to have 4 groups of -2. So we need to bring 4 groups together. So I've got one group here, one group here, one group here, and one group here. So I've got 4 groups, and in each group, I'm going to have -2. So I'm going to have -2 in the first group, -2 in the second group, -2 in the third group, and -2 in the fourth group. And when I do that, I can see the answer to my question by just counting up all the negatives that I now have. So all the counters, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I've got -8 counters. So I know my answer is -8. So 4 times -2 gives me -8. I can also use a number line for this if I'd like. So I could start at 0, and I know I'm going to have 4 groups of -2. So I've got 1 jump, gives me 1 group of -2. 2 jumps gives me 2 groups of -2. 3 jumps gives me 3 groups of -2, and 4 jumps gives me 1 group of -2, and notice it stops at -8. So the first time when I did it with my counters, I got -8. When I used my number line, I got -8. So my answer must be 4 times -2 gives me -8. Make sure that your paper looks like mine, and then let's move on to the next one. Here we are at practice problem number 2, and it's telling you to simplify the expression -8 divided by 2. I want you to try this one on your own, so you're going to go ahead and pause the video now and then press play again to see if your answer is correct. How did you do? Were you able to figure out that the answer was -4? Hopefully you did. If not, go ahead and make sure that your paper looks like mine. Then we're going to move on to a little bit easier way to do this other than using counters and number lines. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now, there's a much easier and much faster way to figure out multiplying and dividing integers other than using counters and other than using a number line, and this is the method that I recommend to you. And this method is based on something that helps me remember called the 4 faces. So hopefully the 4 faces will help you, and it's based on a story that happened to Mr. Porter when he was in middle school. So when Mr. Porter was in middle school, every morning he would wake up, his eyes would be wide open, and he would be very happy when he got up in the morning to go to middle school because he knew that he would be able to learn math. So a positive times a positive gives us a positive. So anytime that we're talking about integers and we're multiplying 2 positives together, that's going to give us a positive. Just like when you did 3rd grade multiplication, a positive times a positive is a positive. That's nothing new. Then Mr. Porter would get ready to go to middle school, and when he got to middle school, he would go to his locker, and his locker would always get stuck, and then he would pull on it very hard, and unfortunately his locker would spring open, and it would hit him in the eye. And then his eye would be bruised, and he would have to close it, and that would make him very sad. So we know that a positive number times a negative number would give me a negative number. So although got 1 positive eye, I've got 1 good eye at the time, I had 1 bad eye, and that would make me upset. So I would be negative. Once I went to the clinic and got my eye all better, I would go to the rest of my classes throughout the day, and then I would head home. And once I was at home, I would walk through the door, and my little sister would be playing with her Barbie doll, and then she would throw her Barbie doll at me, and it would hit me in the other eye that had been recovered all day long, and that would make me very sad. So a negative times a positive is a negative. So I would know that a negative times a positive is a negative, and I would be sad because although 1 eye had gotten better, the other eye was now worse. So I would go get an ice pack from the refrigerator, and I would just want to go to bed, so that when I would go to bed, both my eyes were closed, and I would be happy again. So a negative times a negative is a positive. Now there's a big hint to this. I've been talking about multiplication the entire time during this story. But the big hint is this also works for division. So these rules also work for division. So a positive times a positive is a positive. A positive times a negative is a negative. A negative times a positive is a negative. And a negative times a negative is a positive. So hopefully these rules will be much faster for us than trying to use some counters or trying to carry a number line around, because if you run into multiplying and dividing integers in the world, you're not going to just take all these counters out of your pocket or take a number line out of your pocket. You're going to need to know a way to do it, and this is hopefully helpful to you. So let's go ahead and see this in practice. So here we are at example D, and we're going to be simplifying the expressions. So the first expression is -3 times 4. So before I even begin, I want to know what the sign is going to be of my answer. So I'm going to use the 4 faces over here to help me. So I know that my first number is negative, -3. My second number is positive, +4. So a negative times a positive, although one of my eyes is open, the other one is closed, so I am going to be negative. So I know no matter what happens, my answer is going to be negative. So 3 times 4 is 12, and I know my answer is going to be negative, so my answer is going to be -12. The next problem that I have there is division, and before I even begin, I want to figure out what my sign is. So I've got a -14, so I know that's going to be negative. I've got a -2, so I know that's going to be negative. And negative times a negative. I'm asleep. I'm going to be happy, so I know my answer is going to be positive. So 14 divided by 2 is 7. And since I know my answer is going to be positive, my answer is going to be 7. So using the four faces, I was able to simplify both of these expressions, and hopefully you were to follow along with me. So now let's see you try some on your own. Here we are at practice number 3. I want you to try these two on your own. There you've got a couple circles so that you can use the four faces, and I highly recommend that you do. So I want you to pause the video now, try them on your own, and then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to use the four faces to make sure that you got your answer correct? In the first one, I've got a positive times a negative, so my answer is going to be negative. In the second one, I've got a negative divided by a positive, so my answer is going to be negative. Hopefully, the four faces worked out for you here, and they were much easier than using any counter or number line. Let's go on to the next one. So here we are in example E. In example E, I've got more than one number that I'm multiplying together here. So I'm going to need to keep track of my signs as I go along. So I'm going to do that by having multiple faces. Is that the only way to do it? No. But I'm going to use the faces first, and then I'm going to talk about a shortcut to help me out. So the first thing I've got is I've got a negative 5 times a positive 2. So I've got a negative 5 times a positive 2. So I know that answer is going to be negative because I've got a negative times a positive, which gives me a negative. So I know my first answer will be negative. So I'm going to carry that over to the next face. And then I've got a negative 2, or negative whatever my answer is going to be, times a positive 4. So I know my next number in the line is a positive. So my last answer is going to be negative because a negative times a positive is a negative. So I know whatever I come up with here math-wise is going to be a negative answer. So negative 5 times 2, or 5 times 2 gives me 10. 10 times 4 gives me 40, and I know my answer will be negative, so my answer is negative 40. Now, the next one, I've got 3 times negative 2 times 1 times negative 6. So I've got a whole bunch of numbers that I got to keep track of. So I'm going to start with my first face, and I've got a positive times a negative. So positive times a negative is going to give me a negative. So I know that my first time I'm going to have a negative. Carry that negative over. Then I've got a negative times a positive 1. So negative times a positive is a negative. Carry that negative over. So I've got a negative here times a negative 6. So a negative times a negative is going to be a positive because I'm going to be sleeping. I know whatever my result is going to be a positive answer. So now let's do some multiplication. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 6 is 36, and I know my answer will be positive, so I'm going to get a positive 36. Now, there is a shortcut to do this without having to write out all the faces to determine if you're going to have a positive or a negative when you've got more than one number. If you've got an odd number of negative signs, so the first time I've only got one negative sign, so I know that my answer is going to be negative because anytime I have an odd number of negative signs, it's going to be negative. In the second problem, I've got 2 negative signs, and my answer turns out to be even. So anytime that I have 2 negative signs, they're going to cancel each other out, or 4 negative signs, they're all going to cancel each other out, or 6 negative signs, they're all going to cancel each other out. So I know that my answer will be positive. That's a little bit of a shortcut that I can use. However, if that shortcut is not something I can remember, then I can always use the 4 faces. The 4 faces will always work. Let's go ahead and try some practice on your own. All right, here we've got 3 practice problems for you to try on your own. I want you to pause the video and complete the problems the best that you can, and then press play it again to see if you are correct. One of the problems is a challenge problem, this one over here, because it's got 2 things going on. You've got both division and multiplication. So see if you can do it the best that you can. I want you to pause the video now and then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to get all of the answers correct? If not, don't worry. Go ahead and make your paper look like mine, and then let's go ahead and move on to the next one. So here we are at example F, and it's a word problem. So we're going to have to figure out what our answer is to a word problem. And I know nobody likes word problems. I understand. But we got to work with our word problems to better understand what we're doing in math. So the first one says, you lose 4 points each time you attend PE class without sneakers. You forget your sneakers 3 times. What integer represents the change in your total points? So let's take a look at some words that are very important. We're going to highlight them or underline them if you don't have a highlighter. So you're going to lose 4 points. So lose 4 points, that looks like it's important information, so I'm going to highlight that. Without sneakers, you forget your sneakers 3 times. So it tells us the number of times that you've lost sneakers, so we're going to highlight that. What integer represents the change in your total points? So that's important. That's what the answer is that we're looking for. So now we figured out the important information in our problem. So let's start by making our integer expression. It says you lose 4 points. Well, we know that lose is a term that means negative. So I'm going to have -4 because I'm going to be losing points. If I was gaining points every time I forget my sneakers, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to be losing 4 points every time. And how many times did I forget my sneakers in the problem? I did it 3 times. I forgot. So rather than putting out -4 and -4 and -4 a whole bunch of times and trying to add them together, I'm going to use multiplication. So I'm going to multiply -4 times the 3 times that I've forgotten my sneakers. So now I've got a negative times a positive, so I know my answer if I draw my 4 faces to help me out. If I've got a negative times a positive, I know my answer is going to be negative. And that makes sense because if I'm losing more points every single time, I'm at no point going to end up with positive points for getting my sneakers in PE class. So I would end up with -4 times 3 is going to give me -12. However, I am doing a word problem, so I need to have a word answer. Word problems always, always, always require a word answer. So -12, or since I'm going to be using words, you lose 12 points. So that's a word answer to my word problem. Now you could say you have a total of -12 points lost. That's another way to use words. I used you lose 12 points, but there are many ways to write your answer using words. But if you have a word problem, you need to have a word answer. Let's try it on your own. Here we are at practice number 5, and it says find both the integer expression and simplify it. So 4 roommates share an apartment. The total amount of money owed for their bills in July is $120. How much does each roommate owe? So now I want you to try this problem on your own. Look for the key information in the problem first before you begin writing your integer expression. I want you to pause the video now, find that key information first, then write your integer expression, then simplify it. Then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to identify the key information in the problem? It talks about the total amount of money owed, and the owed is bolded, so that's probably important information for us to know that the amount of money owed is going to be negative. So negative $120 divided by each roommate. So your answer should have been negative $60, or since this is a word problem, each person owes $60 because we need to have a word answer. Let's go ahead and take a look at the last example. Here we are at example G. And example G says the tides are the rise and fall of sea levels. The morning high tide at the beach is 57 inches. Each hour, the tide change falls 3 inches. What is the change after 6 hours? So I'm going to go through first and I'm going to highlight important information in my problem. So I know first that the morning high tide is at 57 inches. I see numbers here, so these numbers are probably important to my problem. Each hour, the tide change falls 3 inches. So falls 3 inches every hour. That's important information. What is the change 6 hours later? So again, I see numbers, so I know that's probably an important piece of information. So now I'm going to have to use my integer expression. Now there are 3 numbers here, and I'm only going to need 2 numbers for my integer expressions. I've got 57, I've got 3, and I've got 6. Well, the 57 just tells me what the tide is now. That's not helping me figure out what the change is. The change is it falls 3 inches. So I know falls is a term for negative. So I've got -3. And then what is the change every 6 hours? So I'm trying -3 and -3 and -3 and -3. I'm not going to write all those -3 outs. I'm going to multiply that. So I'm going to multiply -3 times +6 because we're talking about 6 hours. When I do that, I know I got my four faces, and I can say that a negative times a positive is going to give me a negative answer. So I know that 3 times positive 6 is going to give me negative 18. That's great. And then I know that the change from one to the other was negative 18. However, that doesn't really tell me where the tide is at now. So now I'm going to have to do some math to figure out what the change is from 57. So I'm going to take my 57 inches and I'm going to subtract the 18 inches that I know that is going down. And that's going to give me 39 inches. So it's negative 18, and since I have a word problem, I need a word answer. The tide is now 36 inches. So although I had to use one set of numbers to figure out the integer expression, that was not my final answer. My final answer wanted to know what the change in the tide was, and the tide is now 36 inches after it changed negative 18. I want you to try this last one now on your own. Here we are at practice number 6, and it says the temperature was 84 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon, but dropped to 64 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 5 hours. What integer represents the hourly change? So I want you to try this on your own. You're going to go ahead and pause the video and then press play again to see if you are right. How did you do? Were you able to figure out that the change between 84 and 64 was a negative drop of 20? Did you figure out that over the next 5 hours you would be dividing? And did you figure out the average change is negative 4 degrees? Hopefully you did. If not, go ahead and make sure that your paper looks like mine. That brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, go ahead and throw us a thumbs up. If you love this video, go ahead and throw us a sub, and we will see you in the next one.